I spent the morning going back through what actually happened in Doha over the weekend. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that almost everyone is missing what was really decided in that room. Let me walk you through it. Before I keep going, I'm curious where you land on this. Drop a comment and tell me what you think of the deal. Because honestly, I've gone back and forth on it 3 times since yesterday. So here's the thing about the US-Iran talks in Doha that ended this weekend. They're being reported as technical discussions, diplomatic progress, a step forward. But that's not what I heard when I read through the actual briefings. Let me explain what I mean. Because there's a difference between what the statement says and what the statement actually means. And that gap is where the real power is shifting. The talks happened in Doha, Qatar. Indirect negotiations. Mediators from Qatar and Pakistan shuttling back and forth between the American delegation and the Iranian delegation. Nobody from the US sat down across from anybody from Iran. That much is true. But here's what gets my attention. The Iranians knew that. They agreed to that structure before they ever got on a plane. And that's not nothing. That's actually pretty significant. Think about it. Iran has spent months saying they won't talk to the US directly. They've been clear about that. But they've also been clear that they're willing to talk to anyone else who's willing to talk to the US. That's the dance. That's been the dance for over a year now. But the structure of these Doha talks was different, more formal, more technical, more like a real negotiation, not just a conversation. And that's where the first clue is. Because why would Iran agree to a more structured, more formal process if they weren't serious about something? They wouldn't. They just wouldn't. Now I want you to think about what's been happening with Iran's nuclear program over the last 12 months. Because that's the context that nobody's really talking about on the evening news. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has been reporting something pretty alarming. Their inspectors have been finding uranium enriched to levels that are technically just a few steps away from weapons grade. And when the IAEA asked questions, the Iranians have been less than cooperative. That's the nice way to put it. The real way to put it is that Iran has been stonewalling, pushing back, moving equipment around, making it harder and harder for the inspectors to do their jobs. And every time the IAEA issues a report, every time the Western powers issue a statement, Iran just keeps doing what they were doing anyway. So now you have to ask yourself, if Iran is that confident, that defiant, that unbothered by international pressure, why would they sit down in Doha and negotiate anything at all? That's the question I kept coming back to. And here's where the Doha talks get really interesting. Because the agenda wasn't just about the nuclear program. It wasn't just about enrichment levels or uranium stockpiles. The agenda was bigger than that. The Iranians wanted to talk about sanctions relief. They wanted to talk about oil exports. They wanted to talk about the billions of dollars that are frozen in foreign banks. And they wanted to talk about security guarantees, which is a very diplomatic way of saying they wanted the U.S. to promise not to attack them. Now, the Americans, they had their own list. And the list was also pretty long. The U.S. wanted Iran to stop enriching uranium past a certain percentage. They wanted Iran to accept more intrusive inspections. They wanted Iran to explain the traces of uranium that inspectors found at undeclared sites. And they wanted Iran to stop arming groups in the region: Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. That's the basic shape of the negotiation. And for months, it's been stuck, completely frozen. Nobody moving, nobody giving anything. And then Doha happened. And suddenly, everybody's acting like something actually happened. So what actually happened? The statement that came out of Doha is incredibly vague, deliberately vague. And that vagueness is telling you more than any specific detail ever could. The mediators said the talks were constructive. They said both sides showed a willingness to continue. They said technical discussions were useful. All standard diplomatic language that means absolutely nothing on its own. But underneath that vague language, there was one thing that caught my eye. One thing that made me sit up a little straighter. Both sides agreed to establish working groups. Working groups, technical committees, teams that will meet regularly to discuss specific issues. Now, I know that sounds boring. I know that sounds like bureaucratic nonsense. But trust me, it is not boring. Because when two hostile countries agree to establish working groups, they're agreeing to keep talking. They're agreeing to a structure. They're agreeing to a process. And process is how you build trust. Let me explain why that matters so much. You have two countries, the US and Iran. They haven't had formal diplomatic relations in over 40 years. 40 years. That's not a grudge. That's a generational trauma, honestly. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, the hostage crisis, the sanctions, the nuclear program, the assassinations of Iranian scientists, the killing of Soleimani, the cyber attacks, the tanker attacks in the Gulf. There's so much blood under the bridge that it's almost impossible to see the bridge anymore. And yet, here they are in Doha, agreeing to form working groups. Now I need you to think about the mediators, because the mediators are the real story here. Qatar and Pakistan, two countries that have relationships with both the US and Iran. Two countries that can talk to everyone without being accused of taking sides. But here's what I found interesting. The Qatari role was expected. Qatar's been doing this for years, hosting talks, shuttling messages, being the neutral ground. But Pakistan, that's a different story. That's actually pretty significant. Pakistan has a complicated relationship with Iran. They share a border. They've had tensions over Baluchistan. They've had tensions over sectarian issues. But they also have trade ties. They have energy ties. They have, let's just say they have a relationship that's not easily summarized. So for Pakistan to be brought in as a mediator, that tells you that the US and Iran both trust the Pakistanis to some degree, or at least trust them to deliver messages accurately. That's not nothing. That's actually a pretty big deal. And it tells you something else too. It tells you that the US and Iran are looking for ways to communicate that aren't just through Europe, because Europe has its own agenda, its own pressures, its own sanctions that have to be managed. The Pakistanis aren't European. They're not bound by European Union sanctions. They're not part of the E3. They're their own people with their own interests. And those interests are worth paying attention to. Now, let me get to what I think actually happened in Doha. I think the Americans signaled something quietly through the mediators. I think they signaled that they're willing to ease some sanctions in exchange for Iran freezing their uranium enrichment. Not stopping it entirely, freezing it, holding it where it is right now. And I think the Iranians signaled that they're willing to freeze it in exchange for some sanctions relief. That's the deal that's on the table, at least in the beginning stages. But here's where it gets tricky. Here's where the political reality in both countries starts to push back against the diplomatic reality. In the United States, you have a president who's deeply unpopular, struggling. His approval ratings are in the basement. And any deal with Iran, any deal that looks like a concession, will be used against him by his political opponents. They'll call it weakness. They'll call it appeasement. They'll say he's giving away American leverage for nothing. And in Iran, you have a supreme leader who has to manage his own hardliners, people who don't want any deal with America, people who see the US as the enemy, people who would rather keep enriching uranium than ever appear to capitulate. So both leaders are trapped. Both of them are walking a razor's edge, and any step forward is incredibly fragile. That's why the working groups matter so much. The working groups buy everyone time. They allow both sides to say they're talking without committing to anything. They create a structure that can survive political setbacks. They give everyone space to breathe. And that might be the most important thing. Because a space to breathe is something that hasn't existed between the US and Iran for a very long time. But let me be honest with you. Let me be completely, brutally honest. I don't think this is going to lead to a grand deal, a historic agreement, a new era in US-Iran relations. I don't think that's what Doha was about. I think Doha was about setting a floor, creating a baseline, making sure that the relationship doesn't get worse. Because right now, the relationship is about as bad as it can be without actual military conflict. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night. Because military conflict, a real war between the US and Iran, would be catastrophic for everyone. Think about it. The Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil passes through there. If Iran closes it, if there's a confrontation there, global oil prices go through the roof. Global inflation spikes. The global economy gets thrown into chaos. And that's just the economic part. The military part is even worse. The US has bases all over the region. Iran has missiles that can reach those bases. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, they're all in the middle. And then you have the proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq and Syria. All of them with their own agendas, their own capabilities, their own willingness to escalate. A war between the US and Iran doesn't stay contained. It can't stay contained. It would spread. It would spread like wildfire. That's the context for these Doha talks. That's the weight that everyone in that room was carrying. They weren't just negotiating about enrichment levels. They were negotiating about survival, about avoiding a war that nobody wants, but nobody seems able to prevent. So the fact that they're still talking, that they agreed to working groups, that they're even in the same city, that's actually more than I expected. Now, I've seen some commentary suggesting that this is a breakthrough, a game changer. I don't think that's right. I think it's more like a temporary pause, a chance for both sides to catch their breath, to assess what they really want, to figure out if there's a path forward that doesn't require one side to completely give up everything. Because that's the real problem, isn't it? The US wants Iran to give up their nuclear program completely, permanently, verifiably. And Iran wants the US to lift all sanctions completely, permanently, verifiably. Those two positions are fundamentally incompatible. They always have been. And that's why every negotiation, every round of talks ends up the same way. But Doha was different. Not because the positions changed, but because the format changed. Think about it. Mediators from Qatar and Pakistan, working groups, technical committees, a focus on the details instead of the big picture. That's how you make progress with people you don't trust. You focus on the small stuff, the stuff that's manageable, the stuff that doesn't require someone to lose face. And that's exactly what happened in Doha. The Iranians got their working groups. They got a structure that lets them keep negotiating without having to compromise on their core demands. And the Americans got the same thing, a structure that lets them keep talking without having to give anything away. So the outcome of the Doha talks is actually pretty straightforward. Both sides agreed to keep talking. Both sides agreed to establish a process for more detailed discussions. Both sides agreed to let the mediators keep mediating. And that's progress, I suppose. But here's what I keep coming back to. Here's what bothers me. The Iranians are still enriching uranium. They're still building centrifuges. They're still making progress towards a weapons capability. And the Americans are still maintaining sanctions. They're still applying pressure. They're still making threats about military options being on the table. So nothing has actually changed. The positions are exactly where they were. The only thing that's changed is the conversation. The only thing that's changed is that both sides are still talking instead of fighting. And I'm not sure that's enough. I'm not sure that talking indefinitely, having working groups meet indefinitely, creating a process that never actually reaches a conclusion, I'm not sure that's a strategy. Because while everyone is talking, while everyone is working on the details, the Iranians are still advancing their nuclear program. And the Americans are still losing leverage. There's a clock ticking here, and both sides know it. The IAEA says Iran has enough enriched uranium to produce several nuclear weapons, if they wanted to, if they made the decision to weaponize. That's not a theoretical concern. That's a real concern. And it's getting more real every day. So the question I keep asking myself is this: what happens when the clock runs out? What happens when Iran reaches the point where they could produce a weapon in weeks instead of months? What happens when the US decides that the threshold has been crossed? What happens when someone decides that talking isn't working? That's the real question that Doha didn't answer. And I think that's why the statements were so vague. I think that's why everyone was so careful with their words. Nobody wants to admit that they don't have a solution. Nobody wants to admit that they're just buying time. But that's what's happening. They're buying time. Now, let me tell you what I think happens next. I think the working groups will meet. I think they'll produce reports and recommendations and technical assessments. And I think those reports and recommendations and technical assessments, they'll be vague too, because nobody wants to commit to anything. Nobody wants to be the one who compromises. And as long as nobody compromises, as long as everyone is waiting for the other side to blink, nothing changes. But here's the thing about diplomacy that nobody ever tells you. Diplomatic progress is rarely dramatic. It's rarely a breakthrough. It's rarely a handshake and a photo op and a historic agreement. Diplomatic progress is usually boring. It's working groups. It's technical discussions. It's incremental steps that don't feel like steps at all. But those boring incremental steps, They add up over time. And that's what Doha was. It was a step, an incremental, boring, bureaucratic step. But it was a step in the right direction. And right now, in the relationship between the United States and Iran, a step in the right direction is actually a pretty big deal. So I'll take it. I'll take the vague statements. I'll take the working groups. I'll take the process. I just wish I believed it was enough. Because the stakes here are too high for incrementalism. The stakes here are nuclear weapons and war and millions of lives. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night. We're not just talking about a diplomatic negotiation. We're talking about the future of security in the Middle East. We're talking about the global oil supply. We're talking about the non-proliferation regime that's been in place since the 1970s. All of that is on the table. All of that is at risk. And the outcome of the Doha talks, the outcome of these boring, bureaucratic discussions could determine all of it. So you tell me, does that feel boring to you? Because it doesn't feel boring to me. It feels terrifying. But maybe that's just because I've been reading the briefings. Look, I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I'm not saying war is imminent. I'm not saying Iran is about to get a nuclear weapon. I'm not saying the US is about to launch a strike. But I am saying that the window is closing. I am saying that every day that passes without a real agreement, every day that the negotiations drift without resolution, the options get worse. And that's the truth. That's the reality that nobody in Washington or Tehran wants to admit. They'll keep talking. They'll keep meeting. They'll keep forming working groups. But at some point, someone is going to have to make a decision. A real decision. A decision that commits them to a path. And I don't know if anyone is ready for that. So here's where I land on all of this. The Doha talks were a success. In the narrow sense of the word. They kept the process alive. They kept communication open. They created a structure for future discussions. But they didn't resolve anything. They didn't change anyone's position. They didn't create a breakthrough. And I'm not sure that's good enough. Because while everyone is talking, the danger is still there. The enrichment continues. The sanctions continue. The tension continues. Nothing has changed. And that's the real story of Doha. Not that something happened, but that almost nothing happened. And yet, somehow, almost nothing happening feels like a victory. That's how bad it's gotten. That's how desperate everyone is for any sign of progress. So here's my final thought on all of this. We have to watch what happens next. We have to pay attention to the working groups. We have to track the technical discussions because the details matter. The big picture is too big. The big picture is too hard. The big picture is just too much. But the details, the small stuff, the incremental steps, That's where the real action is. So pay attention. Read the briefings. Follow the reports from Doha and the IAEA and everyone else who's trying to figure this out. Because this isn't over. This is just beginning. And what happens next is going to determine a lot more than just the future of the US-Iran relationship. It's going to determine the future of the entire region. And maybe, just maybe, the future of the world as we know it. So I'll be watching, and I hope you'll be watching too, because the story of Doha isn't over yet. It hasn't even really begun.